Welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Stephen Roy Goodman. I'm here at Arizona State University's DC campus, where we're going to be speaking about civics and legislation, and specifically teaching about civics and teaching about legislation. There are two guests that we have here today. Orde Kittrie, who's a professor of law here at ASU, who teaches a course on legislation, and he's here with his former student, Saki Ververis, who took his legislation course. Saki is now doing Congressional affairs for the Department of Veteran Affairs. So welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Steve.
Well, thank you. Orde, if we can start with you, why do you think it's so important to teach legislation? There's been all this discussion about legislative reform. Why is it important to have a course about legislation?
Look, I think it's important, especially at this pivotal time in U.S. history, for the American people to have a better understanding of how their public policy system works. Typically, in high school and college, you learn a lot about the executive branch, right? The president and what the president does. In law school, you often learn a lot about the courts. You read cases and such. Legislation, the legislature, Congress, is a co-equal third branch of government, and it receives the short end of the stick. And I think that's a mistake.
Saki, do you have a thought or two about that?
Yeah, I have to say, when I started law school in Texas for coming to Professor Kittrie's class, we were learning, just like Professor Kittrie said, about the law and the courts and not really paying much attention to the legislative branch, which is really pivotal in understanding how these laws come to fruition. That process and how lawmakers come to those decisions is really important for trying to understand the whole process and how government works writ large.
And, Orde, if we can get back to you about that. So why don't you think that we are doing enough as a country to focus on the legislative branch then?
I don't know. It's a good question as to why. I think high school and college. There's a tendency. I was a history major in college. There's a tendency to focus on the great man sort of view of history. Focus on the one person who made a pivotal difference. In law school, you sort of focus on the cases. That's the way it's always been. There's less of a focus on the legislature, which is too bad because it's really the legislature that is the most open to input from the public. It was designed that way by the founders as being closest to the pulse, to the thinking of the people. And thus it seems to me that it's actually most important that people understand how the legislative branch functions.
But when I want to go talk to my member of Congress, I have an expectation that my member of Congress is going to be open to me reaching out to them. How are you teaching beyond that?
So the way the course is structured, it's all about how legislative ideas get created and then implemented. So each student in the class, I say to them, come up with there ought to be a law idea, something that ought to be a federal law, and then write that law in this class. I'll help you. Write testimony in support of that law, and come up with a strategy for getting that law enacted, a strategy for building coalitions, a strategy for talking about that law in front of the media, a holistic sort of approach, which gives the students, first of all, a sense of enthusiasm. It's a topic that they chose themselves, a problem that they think is a problem, and it also gives them a practical sense of how the process works. Here are all the different steps to taking an idea and turning it into a law. And I work through with them how, input as to each of those different steps. What makes for effective testimony, what it makes for effective coalition building, what makes for effective grassroots advocacy, how to frame things for the media.
And let's take that to the issue of, let's say you are lobbying or speaking on behalf of people who are veterans. I'm assuming the average veteran who comes to see a member of Congress is concerned about their particular benefit or benefits. But how do we look at it from the perspective of not just one person, but also the people who were all in the Air Force, the people who were all in the Navy or in the Army?
That's a great question. I could say, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here, but most veterans who are reaching out to the members of Congress, I think your instincts are right, are reaching out because of an issue that they're having with the benefits that they feel they should be receiving or the health care they should be receiving. What that allows you to do is hear from members of Congress and hear how the system is impacted in different regions across the country. So what most people don't understand about the VA, for instance, is it has over 350,000 employees. Usually when I go talk to members of Congress and their staff who don't really have that level of familiarity with the department, I'll always ask them to guess the number of employees they think the VA has. And they usually guess between 20 and 40,000 people. And I use that as an opportunity to level set and help people understand this is a scale issue. You know, like there's 350,000 VA employees, over 270,000 of them are dedicated to healthcare, and there are over 18 million veterans across the United States of America. So when I'm talking with members of Congress or their staff about issues, I try to bring that into perspective. Try to say, look, you know, you are having an issue with a veteran. Let's look across our system and see if this is something that's happening to a lot of people, or see if this is something that's happening to this particular person, and see if somehow the system didn't necessarily meet their expectations and how we can try to do better. And that's really the perspective we try to come from department level.
Well, that's really interesting, but I'm assuming that by virtue of the fact that you're speaking to a member of Congress about an issue means that something has gone wrong.
It can be. I mean, it's all about perspectives, right? Sometimes people feel wronged in a situation, but it may not necessarily be that there's a systemic issue. It may be an understanding issue. They may not understand exactly how to access their benefits or what they're actually eligible for. And then it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle because you have to go back and explain to the member and to the individual that, you know, understandably you felt like you were eligible for this particular benefit, but here's why you're not. And that's a hard conversation to have with people, especially when they feel that they may be due. Unfortunately, it's what happens. But I would venture that, you know, the VA in particular probably gets it right 95% of the time. We have over 7 million people enrolled in our healthcare system. So if you get it wrong 5% of the time, you're looking at, you know, almost 50,000 people that it didn't work out for. And if half of those people are going to the members of Congress, you're talking about 25,000 people that are going to talk to their lawmakers about how something didn't work the way that they expected it to. And that's a lot of people, even if you're getting it right 95% of the time.
That's interesting. And if we can broaden that to Congress generally, and you mentioned having your due, that's an interesting point because from my perspective, the people who are going to Capitol Hill are exercising their rights as citizens, and they're saying, you know, this is what I would like to talk to my member about. But isn't that based on the issue of what people feel their rights are? So members of Congress are responding to what people think they ought to have as citizens.
Well, I think that's right. So it becomes important to educate citizens not only about what their current rights are, but also about what the system could potentially achieve for them. And that's always the interesting challenge for members of Congress. There's a problem. How do you come up with a fair and equitable solution to that problem? And that's what I do with the students. I say, look, you know, what is a problem that you see that ought to be solved by a law? And one thing that I tell them that is very distinctive, I say, look, you know, I don't want you to just come up with some pie-in-the-sky idealistic solution to your problem. I want each of you to come up with a solution to your problem where you can say confidently there's a decent chance of it getting passed in the current legislative environment, in the current political climate. And some of the students, that makes a real impression on them. They really appreciate the sort of reality-based element of the class. And they end up having to think, you know, you'll have a student who's left-leaning or a student who's right-leaning, and they'll have to come in and really study what the swing voters in Congress think and are willing to, support. Politics, as I say and as I teach the students, is the art of the possible. And a key element of success in legislative advocacy is figuring out what's the most you can plausibly get, and how do you chart a way between idea and enactment.
That's a very sophisticated thing that you just said. And also, I think it presupposes that a number of students really have a good understanding of the legislative process. How do you get students who don't really understand much about legislation all of a sudden to go to that level?
So these are law students, and you're right. They're law students. They're smart students, but they don't come in with a good sense of the political pulse of America. But I teach the students how to determine what is politically feasible. You identify laws that are analogous, bills that were analogous, that were introduced in previous Congresses. You see how much support they have. You figure out who the swing voters are, right? I mean, right now in this Congress, I tell my students it's really important to understand what, Mitt Romney and Susan Collins and people like that will support, because that's the swing vote in the Senate, and you have to almost immerse yourself in their views on your issue and figure out what they might support. So there are ways of determining what the traffic will bear from a political perspective.
Well, if you don't mind me pressing you on this a little bit, it seems to me that a lot of the issue here might be long before the students even get to your law school class. It seems to me that a lot of this is about whether or not people have a realistic understanding of what's realistic in the political environment. And it seems to me that whether ASU does a good job of this in the law school, or any other law school, or any other college does a good job of this, really depends on how much people are really paying attention to the realities of politics on the ground today.
Well, I think that's right. And I think, I just described what we do in our law school class, but I think you could do this in college and perhaps even in sophisticated high school classes. You could look at how the legislative process really works, what types of bills get passed, how they get passed, and give people a sense also of hope. One of the things that I teach about in my class is that, it's not just wealthy donors who get laws passed. There's some great examples of groups. There's a group called Results that campaigns on climate change issues and lending for the poor overseas. There are groups that get great results through deploying well-educated citizen activists. And by well-educated, I don't mean they went to fancy schools, but, Results trains their volunteers really well how to make a case to a member of Congress in an effective, respectful way, and they managed to get legislation passed. And that's something that people don't understand. I think there's a perception out there that the system is entirely a captive of the rich and the well-connected. And it's not. It's still possible for others to make a difference. But they have to do it the way you approach anything in life, which is with skill, focus, and dedication.
And I'll just break in really quick. When I went through Professor Kittrie's class, we actually got to meet with lawmakers. They weren't just a pundit or speaking with pundits on television. They were there, and they were completely charismatic, good people that were willing to actually connect with folks and talk with them about the process from their time on the Hill versus coming into the Hill and what it looked like for them. And as a student, it really brought a lot of what we were learning into focus, which I think helped a lot to understand a little bit better how the work that we would be doing could be impactful.
Well, that's interesting that you did that when you were in Orde's class. Now that with your current job, do you find that sometimes you're now giving some of the same advice to some people who are veterans who are now looking for advice on how they can speak respectfully to their members of Congress?
Yeah, absolutely. After Professor Kittrie's class, and once I got to the Hill, I actually became a board member of an organization called Hill Vets. And through Hill Vets, we started to try to attract veterans who had the right kind of background and education, who wanted to meet with policymakers. And I think for most of us that have been on the Hill, everyone's pretty willing to hear anybody who has aspirations to go to the Hill, meet with them, and then give them an informational interview to try to give them advice on how to do it. And of course, with my background, being a veteran, my door is always open to veterans who are interested in working on Capitol Hill and learning more about the legislative process.
But when you were in the Air Force, did you have any training about public policy issues and how to interact with government in that way?
Not in the Air Force. In high school in Massachusetts, I did take a class in Acton-Boxborough Regional High School that focused on policy and politics, and we did things in Massachusetts around governor elections and things like that to see what the process was like, and I definitely got the bug back then. But I think it was really coming to DC and getting to see it from the DC perspective that really got me hooked. I was in the Texas legal market. I was graduating law school out in Texas, and I knew that the DC policy world is where I wanted to make my bones.
That's interesting. Well, we've been doing this show for 10 years. No one's ever shouted out to their high school. So you're the very first one. So thank you for that. So Orde, in terms of students who come from, whether they're from high school in Massachusetts or Texas or anywhere else, what are some basic things that you expect them to understand before they even walk into your classroom?
I can talk about some of the things that I want them to understand once they leave the class. One thing that I hope that they'll leave the class with is a greater sense of optimism for the ability of individuals to affect the process. We'll read about members of Congress, or we'll talk to members of Congress, will say they appreciate when sort of the average American, a veteran or whoever it is, comes to their office. They find it more memorable, more interesting to talk to sort of quote-unquote real Americans than they do to, lobbyists, who will come in on the basis of one issue one week and on the basis, to advocate for another issue another week. I also hope that the students will develop the tools to not only understand the legislative process, but also legislative advocacy is similar to advocacy in other fields. You got to figure out how to frame the issue. You have to speak concisely. You have to be good at bringing the issue alive, explaining why it matters to real people, and you have to think about your audience, the member of Congress, and why, given their background, given the state that they represent, given their values, given the positions that they've taken, why they might support what you're advocating. So these are skills, I think, that are applicable not only to legislative advocacy, but that are applicable to advocacy more broadly. Obviously, not just advocacy by lawyers as lawyers, but advocacy by people in general. And I think that this is something that high schools will have a debate course, will have a public speaking course, but my sense is they don't necessarily do a good enough job of teaching all of their students advocacy, what the elements are of a strong argument, how to rebut an argument against you. That sort of thing I think is really important, and I wish it were offered more broadly at both the high school and the college level, the elements of advocacy, the elements of rhetoric, of making a strong argument.
Well, that's an interesting point, and I wonder whether or not a lot of high school teachers and college professors are afraid of engaging in some of those discussions because some of those discussions can lead to some very contentious issues, right? So in concept, we think it's important to advocate for something, but let's say if we're advocating for X, the people who don't believe in X are advocating the other way, so there might be different opinions here, and people could be very upset about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge. I know in my class, we managed to do it in such a way that people don't feel insulted or hurt. It's a law school class. I think that there is a challenge. I mean, I know my daughter, I ask her what she discusses, what she writes about in class, and the joke is that it's always a fruit or vegetable. And I said, gee, this week you're reading about corn, last week it was about potatoes. Why about fruits or vegetables? She says, well, she's 11. She says, well, that's the only thing that the teachers feel comfortable talking about. Anything else is too controversial. And I think that's a loss. I think there are ways of talking about things that are a little bit more controversial than fruits and vegetables, and it's imperative that our education system figure out a way to do it.
Do you have a thought or two about that, Saki?
Yeah, the longer that I spend time in the Washington, D.C. area, the more that I realize that it really is about having an ability to communicate with people. And that only comes by having conversations, and sometimes those conversations may not be comfortable conversations. But I think that you can come to it with a bit of respect for the opposing argument, a little bit of appreciation for the fact that you may not be able to convince everybody in a room on a particular point, but try to hit all of the major points that you think are important to your argument and really try to listen and respond to other people's positions as well.
But it seems to me that as a country, we're not necessarily succeeding at that right now. And one could say that in many times in our history that we've had trouble with that. Is there something that we could do in the education world to foster that a little bit better? That's a great question, and I don't think there's a silver bullet there. But I think that we have to give people a little bit of space to be wrong. I think that there is a position in academia and the liberal arts where you want to shame people into making the right choice, coming to the right conclusion on things. And you're not going to get everybody that way. And frankly, I think that trying to shame people into a position that's more agreeable, even if it's for all the right purposes. One of my favorite sayings right now is, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think that you can really put yourself in a position where you're ostracizing people and you are, in fact, a driver of divisiveness without really knowing that you are, because you're trying to help people get to the right conclusion. And it's okay for people to be wrong. I don't think our system is built for everybody to be on the same page. It's a messy system, and I think it's that way by design. We should give people a little bit more space, I think. That's interesting. And you mentioned by design. I mean, one of the political questions, I suppose, that people will ask is the legislative system is designed in a particular way, but that inherently means that it's skewed in a particular direction, which means, like, for instance, it's very hard for a bill to become a law. Well, some people could say that that's an inherently political bias that's built into the system because it's hard for a bill to become a law, as opposed to make it easier in other systems. Do either of you have a thought or two about, is that a political issue?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I study with the students in my class, the concept of veto gates, that in the U.S. political system, and there's a reason why it was designed that way, right? I mean, there was a libertarian bent to some of the founders of the United States. They believed that in a light touch in terms of the government, they wanted to make it hard to enact laws because they felt that the people should be left to their own devices as much as possible. So you have not only the checks and balances where Congress passes it, but they need the president to sign it, or they have to overcome a veto. But even within Congress itself, the way Congress is structured, there's so many different veto gates. I teach the students that it's much easier to block a law than to get a law passed. And that puts a lot of power in the hands of lobbyists, because they just need one committee chairman or whatever it is along the way of a bill to sit on the bill, and that's the end of the bill. That's the way the system is. Some of it is enshrined in the Constitution, the presidential veto power, but others, it's up to Congress. And if Congress wanted to get rid of committee chairs tomorrow, have fewer veto gates within the congressional process, they could. And that's a choice, and it's a choice that the people should know about, and people should know about why the system was designed the way it is and the positive goals that it was designed to achieve.
Well, fair enough. I think we only have a few minutes left. Is there anything that I have not asked that either of you wanted to mention to a Higher Education Today audience about teaching civics or teaching legislation?
I'll go first. I think it's really important that people engage in dialogue and conversation in the classroom. I think one of the biggest mistakes I made as a law student and as a student throughout my academic career was just trying to memorize the book terminology and internalize that, and then try to get it on paper when it came time for exams. But I think students would gain a lot from more dialogue in the classroom, getting it wrong in front of a professor who's there to help shepherd them in the right direction and say, well, you kind of missed exactly how this regulation relates to this statute, for instance, and having someone there to help you understand how to speak to the issues, I think would be very beneficial in the classroom.
And I suppose you would probably agree that not only in the classroom, but also extracurricularly as well.
Absolutely. And I don't think enough can be said about trying to engage with your fellow human beings on things that you're working on. I think helps you get outside of your head and understand things on a much better level.
I think it's an important challenge for the U.S. educational system to think about how to teach advocacy and rhetoric in a way that doesn't insult people, doesn't downgrade people, but instead gives Americans a sense of hope that they can make a difference in their political system, because they can, and they need to be reminded of that, and they need to be given the tools to make a difference. This is a pivotal time in America's history, and we need as many Americans as engaged as possible in a really thoughtful, educated way. And I think the educational system needs to do a better job of analyzing success stories, how in this high school class and that college class and that law school class, there's been an effective teaching of legislation, legislative advocacy, policy decision-making, and take those examples and spread them more widely across the educational system.
Well, that was very thoughtful. So thank you both very much.
Thank
you, Steve.
If you would like to reach out to me directly at the show, please go ahead and do so by sending an email to highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Stephen Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.